Harm reduction is the radical notion that drug users are people. This is an adaptation of a quote by Marie Scheer. Feminism is the radical notion that women are people. Just in the same way that women are treated as second-class citizens for no reason, so are people who use drugs. When I was asked to give this presentation, at first I thought, no, it shouldn't be me. We should be elevating the voice of somebody who has experienced this kind of oppression in a more real way than I have. But then I realized that just as it's the responsibility of white people to educate each other about racism, rather than asking people of color to bear the mental and emotional burden of doing that education, it is our responsibility to educate each other. Just as the people who care for these populations are responsible for educating each other about the oppressions that they face. This topic is important because, particularly in the area of perinatal substance use, for a really long time, everyone has agreed that we need to respond with compassion and treat this as a public health problem, and that punishment is counter-effective. And yet, we respond with punishment and surveillance and judgment. We have all been taught to hate and mistrust people who use drugs. And therefore we build systems of oppression against people who use drugs. But the only way to dismantle the systems is to first begin to dismantle the implicit bias in ourselves.
Acknowledge the indigenous nations in this area. The Wichita, or as they call themselves, the Kirikiriish, traditionally were the caretakers of this land that we're standing on. And I'd like to highlight language today for both of the nations that I'm going to be talking about because it sort of demonstrates the completeness of the physical and cultural genocide that was inflicted upon these people. This is a photo of Doris Jean Lamar McLemore, who looks like a badass if I ever saw one. And she was the last native speaker of the Wichita language, and she's now passed away. So that's heartbreaking. The language is such a foundation of a culture for people, and to have your last native speaker pass away, it's the end of an era. So I'm going to say it a few times. The Wichita, and I invite you to repeat it along with me if you would like. It is pronounced Kirikiriish, Kirikiriish, Kirikiriish. And then a little more difficult, I'm going to do my best to ask how are you all. It would be Eshi Rashi Sak. Eshi Rashi Sak. There you go. And you can go to the website on the slides, and they have a whole library of recorded language. And I think that's, as a person whose ancestors were the invading colonizers, I feel that this is literally the least I can do to try to repair some of that damage that was done by people that look like me. The other nation that was traditionally caretakers of this land are the Comanche, or as they call themselves, the Numunu. And they have an outreach office in Dallas. I would encourage anybody that's interested to go check that out. There's a language app you can download for your phone to help learn that language. And there's also a beginner's language packet with like flashcards and videos and stuff. I've ordered it. It has not arrived yet. I'm super excited. You may recognize the Comanche from the movie Code Talkers. This is a photo of the young men who served in World War II using their language, which nobody else knew, and was a very effective tool for the United States. So we want to honor both the past and present elders and honor them. So now we'll get going on the meat of the talk. talk. And I included that little bias, it's not just for other people, because it's really, really important for everybody to acknowledge our own imperfection. And that doesn't mean that you're a bad person or you're wrong. It's just, this is part of being human. We all have these. I had a conversation with a nurse one time that I worked with where she said, I can't be racist, I'm Mexican. And that being a member of an oppressed group is not any kinds of protection against having implicit bias. I have biases against women, and I am a woman. I find myself thinking things about, for example, somebody will be driving in a certain way and I'll look and I'm like, yep, it's a woman. And I'm a woman, and I think that, and then I have to refocus myself and recognize that, because that's the only way that you can root it out of your own self. You have to look at it in its ugly, ugly face, and it's embarrassing. But that's the way that we get rid of it. So implicit, these definitions I'm going to use for this talk, they're not technically exactly how Merriam-Webster would define them, but for us, implicit means unconscious. So that means that these are things that happen in the part of our brain that we don't really notice, we don't really control. It just happens, like breathing. When we talk about bias, it's not the same as prejudice. Prejudice is conscious. Bias is just kind of an inclination, a leaning that we all have. And let's see, and then privilege, for our purposes, privilege is an advantage that is not applied based on merit. So for example, I am more likely to get a job because I am white. And that doesn't mean I'm better for that job, that is a thing that happens, and it's not based on my merit or how good I am. And I want to talk to you about intersectionality a lot. That's going to be a theme in this talk, because people that use drugs that are women already have two intersecting forms of discrimination that they face. If they happen to be a woman of color, if they happen to be somebody who has different abilities, perhaps they drive a wheelchair, perhaps there is dyslexia, there's all kinds of different things that can intersect to inform the way that other people see us. One way that I really think is useful for explaining this is from the book So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijoma Oluo. And she talks about implicit bias as, so you've been brought up in this culture where people walk down the streets and as they talk, they're flailing their arms around like this. And everybody in your culture is aware of that and knows, and they walk far apart from each other. And then you go to somewhere else, and you're on a crowded sidewalk, and you're walking around, flailing your arms, and you're not trying to hit anybody, but you do hit people. And so the idea is that intention does not mitigate impact. If you break somebody's nose and you didn't mean to, their nose is still broken. And so that helps me understand a lot. And another thing that I want to point out is oftentimes these biases for other groups that we've all been talking about, especially in the last few years, are implicit. But for people that use drugs, many times they're not. I'm sure we've all heard people say things about people who use drugs that are explicit, that are directly acknowledging that the person who's speaking does not like people who use drugs, or thinks that they are bad parents, or that they shouldn't have control of their own health care. So we're talking about implicit bias, but it's not always implicit. Couple more definitions before we can really get going. Stigma, for our purposes, I've seen a few definitions and I like them all. The one that I usually use is it's shame that's imposed externally. So it's not an internal feeling like I am bad, I did something wrong. It's other people saying you should be ashamed of yourself. And it's all-encompassing. This is something that people encounter everywhere they go, every day, all the time, from their family, from employers, from people they walk by on the street. Everyone, all the messages that they hear are, you're bad, you should be ashamed. Pride and shame are opposites. Pride is the satisfaction with your own good bits, basically. So it's acknowledging and knowing that you are a good person, that you're deserving of respect. Shame is the opposite of that. It's disgrace, it's humiliation. So when you'll see, sometimes I wear a button or a t-shirt that says proud to be a drug user. Oh, and I didn't mention that. I've done all the drugs. Most of them are fun. I haven't really, I've never had a problem that I would define as a problem. According to DSM-5, I have a very serious problem with caffeine, but otherwise, I'm good. Proud to be a drug user. This isn't, I'm not talking about the kind of pride that's better than. It's the kind of pride where you can hold your head up high and stand tall and know that you are worth something. And so, pride is necessary for positive change. If you don't think you're worth something, then you're not worth the effort of trying to change your substance use or trying to improve your life. If you have shame, then you don't think you're worth it and you don't make that effort. So it's really important to think about those as opposites. So just some examples of the kinds of implicit bias that probably everyone in here is aware of. I'm going to go quickly over this because I think we all kind of know. There's lots of NICU quality studies that have been coming out lately showing that people of color receive poorer quality care regardless of the race of the person providing that care. We all heard about Serena Williams' experience earlier this year, and that's an example of, well, did they do it on purpose or did they not? It doesn't matter, because intention does not mitigate impact. She still had that near-death experience because she felt unlistened to, and whether it actually had anything to do with her race is irrelevant. It had to do with her race because she felt that it did. Gender. There's a great study about access to elective sterilization between men and women. This is something that I've dealt with myself. I've been asking for elective sterilization for a very long time, and they won't do it without the approval of my male partner. When men go to get a vasectomy, they get it like that. You're in, you're out, you're done. There's not that assumption that to be a man, you must also be a father, which is something that us women face a lot. Another great study about women in office housework. So this is like making coffee, tidying up, remembering birthdays, planning outings. This is the kind of thing that women are expected to do. These are the assignments that we're given while our male counterparts are given the more prestigious and exciting ones. Let me see, where are we? Weight. I included this book, Shrill, by Lindy West. Discriminating against people who are bigger has been something that I've been working on myself in the last several years, and this book was really, really helpful in helping me to recognize my biases and start to try to change them. So I recommend that highly. There's a lovely, it's an opinion piece. It was published in a journal for MDs, and it's called There's No Point Telling You to Lose Weight, and it's by this person who has been dieting and trying for decades, and nothing's working. And so she says to her doctors, there's no point telling me to lose weight, especially if I'm coming in for something unrelated. And we do that to people who use drugs a lot. Say you come in for a respiratory infection, and the doctor only wants to talk about your substance use, and they don't want to take care of any of the other parts of you that might be more important to you. With the LGBTQ community, lesbian gynecological needs very frequently get overlooked. A lot of folks think they don't need to go in for their pap smear. The health disparities for youth are just staggering, so I'm taking too much time on this. I advise you to check out those studies, and they will be in the end in the references. So now I'm going to tell you some stories about people that I have loved and do love. I want you to think about these as if they're the people in your lives that use drugs that you love. And if you don't have somebody in your life that uses drugs, well, you do, but you just don't know about it. But if you don't, think about, that one niece or cousin you have that just keeps making wrong decisions, and you love them, and you believe in their potential. You don't condone their activities, but you love them anyway. So, and I want us to all remember that ourselves and the people we know are not the exception to the rule, because we always have this idea that like, oh yeah, I used cocaine a couple times in college, but then I stopped, I'm fine, I'm not like those other people. You're exactly like those other people. 80 to 90% of people who use drugs don't develop a problem. And so it's not just, one or two people. It's hard for us to admit that, especially in professional situations, but probably most of us in here have done an illegal drug at some point in our lives. We are not the exception, we are the rule. So the first one, Bella, she was an esthetician. She grew up in a rural part of the state, and then once she got licensed, she moved to Seattle, where I'm from. And she was struggling to find work enough to be able to get housing. She ended up living outdoors, and she also was using drugs when she could afford it. She was involved in an accident where she was riding her bike and she was hit by a car and paralyzed from the neck down. And once she, several months later, got out of the acute phase in the hospital, she was trying to find a placement in an adult family home where she could be near her family who lived in that rural area. And at least a dozen facilities rejected her because of her history of substance use. And they said she was likely to be a behavior problem. And Bella died last year, very far away from her family as a result of that. And that's explicit bias, you guys. There's nothing implicit about that. And at the time, I just thought it was so absurd. How is she going to create problems? She can't move. She's completely helpless and paralyzed. And you're saying that you're afraid to touch her because she used to use drugs? The next one I want to talk about is Ronnie. And he, in his early 20s, he had a 6-figure job in finance. He had a wife and a young child. And I don't know what precipitated the change. I suspect it might have just been how a lot of young men have their mental illness present in their early 20s. But I met him years and years later. By that time, he had been unhoused for a very long time, in and out of jail constantly. He was well known in the neighborhood. None of the businesses would serve him. But he would come to the needle exchange, and that's how we got to know each other. And once we got to know each other, he was the sweetest, kindest man that you would ever meet. He never had anything bad to say about anybody. He was always so kind. And he frequently would get abscesses from substance use and some from just sleeping outdoors and getting bit by all kinds of rats and bugs and spiders. And he would always go to the ER, and they would always lance his abscesses with no pain medication at all. And then they would give him a dose of Tylenol and send him on his way with an open wound back to sleeping outdoors. And one day he came by and he was limping, and he had broken his ankle, and I'm a nurse, I don't usually diagnose, but you could see it. It was poking in the skin. And he said, oh no, it happened a couple days ago, I'm not gonna go to the doctor, they'll just be mean to me, I'm not gonna go to the doctor, they'll just be mean to me. And I tried so hard, I said, I will call in sick, I will go with you, I will stay by your side, I will raise a stink, and nothing I could say could get him to go get treatment for that. And so it just healed all wonky, and he had a limp for the rest of his life until he also died last year. And these are the kinds of things that we are teaching people. We're teaching people not to seek help. We're teaching people, because you use drugs, you deserve to feel this pain. You deserve to have somebody stick a scalpel into your arm and make a cut with no pain medicine. And that's why people aren't coming to us. It's a really reasonable reason. The last one I'm going to talk about is Leah. She's the success story. She was 20 years old. She was amazing. I wish I could do as much stuff as she did. She was a volunteer that I was supervising at the syringe access program. She was a participant in our program, so she was using injection drugs, mostly meth. She was enrolled in college full-time. She had a part-time job, and at the syringe access program, she conceived, designed, and implemented a program that is still running to this day. It's just amazing. All of this while living in a car with her partner who was physically and emotionally abusive. In this context, she wanted desperately to have a baby. And a lot of times we talk about people who use drugs, oh, all of these are unwanted pregnancies, unplanned, unwanted. I don't think that's true. I think we need to look at our data collection a little bit more because people want to have babies, whether they use drugs or not. A lot of people do. So she got pregnant in this context. While she was pregnant, she and her partner stopped using drugs. They were working on housing and employment. She ended up getting employment and housing very far away from where she was. And a few days before she was set to move, her water broke at 25 weeks. And so she was in the hospital, she was on bed rest, but her family was not going to have a place to live in a couple days. So at this time, she's on bed rest, she's in the hospital, she's terrified of preterm labor, she's organizing the move, she has linked herself to care in her new hometown, but the hospital, because of her history of substance use, says, no, you're drug seeking, you're leaving AMA, and she had developed an infection during this time, and they said, we're not gonna give you PO antibiotics to take on your trip to your new hospital. After that, she went anyway, because where is she gonna live? What is she gonna do if she loses these opportunities that she set up for herself? She went anyway, ended up developing an infection and delivering her daughter at 25 and 4. And that could have been prevented if people had taken the time to get to know her situation and to learn about why she was making the choices that she was making. But oftentimes we don't do that because we say, I know why she's making that choice, she's a drug user. And that's all that we can see. But there's so much more to our patients than that. And so I want to look at some of the messages that we tell people that use drugs. And there's going to be several of these. So this one, doing meth won't make it easier to hook up. We've all seen these. And I'll have to tell you, I know a lot of people that use a lot of meth, and I've never seen that. You can use meth and also brush your teeth and wash your face. It's entirely possible. I've seen it. But the messages that we're sending people that use drugs are, you are disgusting and no one will ever love you. That's what this says, between the lines. We tell people that their brain is fried, that they're damaged beyond repair, that they might as well shoot themselves. And then I love the one all the way over on the right because there's always an element of, what about the children? What about the children? What about the children? None of those kids is a drug pusher. The messages that we send about substance use are just ridiculous. They're not based in fact. And part of that is because we think that facts are somehow not helpful. We think we need to fearmonger and scare people, scared straight. We've known for decades that these policies are not effective, and yet we're still using them because people find it unpalatable to tell the truth to people that use drugs. To say, yeah, you might not have a problem, and that's okay. But instead, we tell them, no, you definitely have a problem. There's something very wrong with you. This is outgoing governor of Maine, Paul LePage, and he is one of my favorites because he's one of the ones that doesn't even talk in code. He just straight up says these horribly hurtful and racist things. His deal is he doesn't want to approve naloxone legislation because he says naloxone doesn't save lives, it just prolongs the inevitable. So that message is, if you use drugs, you might as well be dead, and I don't care if you do die. He intersects his oppressions that he inflicts upon people very beautifully in this quote. He says, "These guys with the name D-Money, Smoothie, Shifty, these types of guys, they come from Connecticut and New York, they come up here, they sell their heroin, they go back home. Incidentally, half the time they impregnate a young white girl before they leave, which is a real sad thing because then we have another issue we have to deal with down the road." So, he's, like I said, he's not even speaking in code. He just says this straight up. And he stayed in office for 8 years because nobody cares. Nobody cares about the people that I love. Nobody cares about people that use drugs. Because if you said this about any other underprivileged group, you would be out so fast. There's no way this would stand. And then to call this, imaginary biracial baby an issue that we have to deal with. Who here wants to be an issue that somebody has to deal with? It's just, it's acceptable, it's normalized, and it's mainstream to hate people that use drugs. And then the inevitable conclusion that people come to is this: let them die. We don't care. And this is an opinion piece. I forget what paper it was in, but it was in one of the big national ones. This is published. Who approved this headline? This is just, it's unacceptable. It makes me so angry that I'm shaking. And then this also gets translated into policy on a national level. This is President Duterte from the Philippines. A few years ago, he launched his own version of a war on drugs, wherein he instructed not just police officers and government employees, but neighbors and families to kill people suspected of using or selling drugs. At the time of this headline, the death toll was 6,600. It's more than double that now. People are just being killed for using drugs. And this is something that all of us say is a health problem and should be responded to with compassion, and yet that doesn't translate into action. And I want to be clear. I'm not making a partisan statement when I say President Trump says he's doing a great job, because most of our politicians by their actions, think the same thing. Many doctors and nurses that I interact with, and that I'm sure you have, think the same thing. We should just kill them. I was speaking to somebody today who said they had a colleague that said, instead of spending money on naloxone, we should be spending it on shovels to bury them. These are our friends and family members. These are people that I love and that you love. And to be able to say publicly, I don't care how many of these people will die, the fact that we're not all in an uproar with pitchforks and torches right now is shocking to me. This is unacceptable. So when we throw pregnancy into this situation where people are already just facing vile and disgusting stigma, it just gets worse. And this is, once you become pregnant, it's no longer everyone in the outside world that hates you. Now it's people that you use drugs with that also hate you. We had somebody physically attack a pregnant person accessing syringes at the needle exchange where I work. Somebody else that was in line with her, telling her, you're a bad mom, you shouldn't be doing this. This quote is from, 8 or 10 people that I've worked with at separate times. She should be in jail for that. And we know from earlier presentations from, this is a study from Dr. Cleveland, where she did really lovely qualitative interviews with folks. People don't start a habit during pregnancy. People find themselves becoming pregnant in the context of their rest of their life, just like the rest of us. We don't come into being with pregnancy. We have other stuff that comes along with it. There's tons and tons of resources for that. I included Dr. Cleveland's because it just has excellent, excellent stories in it. The 4A 2015 study talked about how pregnant people and people in general typically have periods of abstinence and use throughout their life. People are trying to make positive changes, and we all know that relapse is an expected part of the process. And yet somehow when people relapse, we fire them as patients, or we take away services from them, or we make it harder. We put up even more barriers to access care and to improve their health than they had before. The Torchala study from 2015 is another really excellent qualitative study where people kind of talk in depth about their substance use and what it means to them, and it's another really heartbreaking one that I encourage everybody to read. But these are not people who woke up one day and decided they wanted to hurt a baby. These are people that love their baby to be, that want to be pregnant, and that want our help and not our judgment. I'm going to read this whole thing. It's from ACOG. What are they? They're the OBGYNs. Drug enforcement policies that deter women from seeking prenatal care are contrary to the welfare of the mother and fetus. Incarceration and the threat of incarceration have proved to be ineffective in reducing the incidence of alcohol or drug abuse. Obstetrician gynecologists should be aware of the reporting requirements related to alcohol and drug abuse within their states. They are encouraged to work with state legislators to retract legislation that punishes women for substance abuse during pregnancy. So that's 4 sentences, and I'm just going to unpack it a little bit. Drug enforcement policies that deter women from seeking care are reporting requirements. They are screening of body fluids. They are threats of child apprehension, as well as threats of incarceration and criminalization, loss of housing, loss of financial aid, loss of employment. All of these things work together to encourage people who become pregnant not to seek care. So the role of OBGYNs, and I would argue all of us in this room, is to work with your state legislatures and get rid of these nasty laws and policies. The legislators, they have good intentions, but they don't know what they're doing. We know. Or criminalization do not increase a parent's ability to stop drug dependency, which when you say it out loud, it's like, well, yeah. But that's how we're responding to this public health crisis, in a way that is directly counterproductive. And so even though we say all the right things, and I mean, ACOG's been saying that for like 20 years, but still, we're criminalizing and stigmatizing these families. We do it for their own good, because they can't be trusted to take care of themselves. These moms are incompetent. They're dangerous. They're less than. They're undeserving of health care. They're undeserving of love. They're undeserving of respect. And they're undeserving of reproduction. That's what our actions are saying, even though our mouths are saying all the right things. And it's up to us to change that. I usually talk a lot about language, but due to time constraints, I'm not going to. But just on this slide, I want us to notice some of the language. Prescription pills are becoming street drug of choice. What's a street drug? That's not a thing. Another thing I want to point out is oxytocin. Is so cute, right? What a cute little nickname for these kids. Victims of abuse. So the implication there is that they are victims of their mothers who are abusing them. And we all say with our mouths, substance use is not child abuse. But when we have these messages that are bombarding us and the people we serve all the time, we receive a different message. Here's another one. Mother charged after newborn tests positive. Last year I went to Hawaii to present to ACOG District 10, and I was talking about criminalization, and in the cab on the way there, I started telling the cab driver what my presentation was about. He was like, "Oh, that's good, we need to arrest them all, lock them all up." And that's a knee-jerk reaction. And if you don't have the information, that's what seems like it would make sense. And these aren't people that are evil or mean, they're just people that maybe haven't thought about this before and don't have all the information. And so it is up to us to give people that information and to challenge them to change the way they think about these families. We definitely all know that we need systems change. Systems are the problem. But until you're able to identify the internal biases that we all have and recognize those and be humble about them, we can't really make that systems change because you won't be able to recognize the larger structures that create those biases. And I joke around sometimes that I take great pride in my humility, but I do. I want to be a humble person. I want that to be a part of my identity. And part of that is being really uncomfortable and messing up and admitting it and saying, "I'm sorry, how can I do better?" And that's something that we all need to be willing to do. It's okay if you're not perfect. I don't really love a whole lot about AA and 12-step, but the first step to any kind of positive change is identifying the problem. And doing that is really hard and uncomfortable. I've said that like 1,000 times, but this talk for me is hard and uncomfortable. And this is just something that we've all got to do. One thing that I found helpful in identifying these areas and blind spots are privilege checklists. So you can find these online for various groups. My organization has made one for substance use, and what that ends up looking like is, because we all use substances. I look out and on almost every table I see something with caffeine. We're probably all gonna go and have a glass of wine after this because it's been so stressful and difficult. And so we're all substance users. The privilege checklist reminds us of our privileges in those areas. So for example, if your substance of choice is wine, after this is over, you can go anywhere in the city and find clean, safe, clearly labeled and dosed substance of choice. And that's a privilege that not a lot of the people that we're talking about this week can have. Another thing is, I don't want to stigmatize the rosé all day crowd at all. I want to just point out that you can have a glass of wine and be considered a good parent. You can smoke a cigarette and be considered a good parent who doesn't deserve to have their child taken away from them. I was talking with a doctor at this conference and he was saying, "Oh, cannabis is changing everything because you can actually have a healthy pregnancy and use cannabis." You can have a healthy pregnancy and use anything. The reason that people are having all these negative outcomes is because we are forcing them into the margins, and we're withholding privileges and we're putting up barriers. This isn't intrinsic to drugs. It's not about the drugs, it's about the context. Some of you may be aware, methamphetamine is a Schedule II medication that can be prescribed to people for ADHD and narcolepsy, children as young as 6. I've taken care of people that are on these medications that have pregnancies, and they're healthy and they're fine. It's the context, it's not the substances themselves. I absolutely am not suggesting that all pregnant people should take drugs and shouldn't be worried about it at all. I'm just saying, when we focus on that one little piece, we neglect prenatal care and housing and self-pride and self-efficacy, which are far more important to outcomes than what substance somebody put into their body. Really quickly, before we move on entirely, I want to just offer a few resources. So these are a few books that are really wonderful. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts is pretty famous. That's by a doctor in Canada who serves people who use drugs chaotically. High Price by Dr. Hart is one of my favorites. He's a mentor of mine. He's a neuropsychopharmacologist at Columbia, and so he studies how drugs work in our brains and how it influences behaviors. So I really like his work because a lot of people look at behaviors and a lot of people look at pharmacology, but really we need to bring that together because nobody exists in a vacuum. Nobody's behaviors are not influenced by their brain chemistry. Addicted, Pregnant, and Poor by Kelly Ray Knight is a fascinating ethnographic book where she spent a lot of time with women living in single-room occupancy hotels in San Francisco and followed their pregnancies and their hopes and dreams and desires. And she does a really excellent job of presenting a whole person, not just a pregnant drug user. Law Enforcement Action Partnership used to be called, I like their old name better, they were called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. These are current and former cops, district attorneys, law enforcement types who have been on the other side of this so-called war on drugs and have realized that it is ineffective, it is racially based, it's class-based, and they're fighting to end it. So I always find that that's a really useful resource for people that are kind of on the fence or a little skeptical about harm reduction, and so check that out. Louise Vincent is the president of the Urban Survivors Union, which is a drug user union that has chapters all over the country. And she writes really wonderful articles about her own experiences with substance use and her daughter's experiences with substance use. So I highly recommend that article and any others that she has written. Rewire.news is a news site that focuses on reproductive health, and they also have a really excellent coverage of substance use in pregnancy and also the laws around that. A lot of their journalists are former or current lawyers, so they really understand that stuff. National Advocates for Pregnant Women is a nonprofit that does pro bono work for people that experience unfair treatment related to their pregnancies for a multitude of reasons. They do a lot of abortion work, a lot of miscarriage work, and also a lot of work for people who use drugs. Elizabeth Rico has a blog called Betty's Battleground, where she talks really vulnerably and just opens up her chest and shows you what's inside and what's happening with her and her children and her own recovery journey. So these are some really good resources. I have lots more. I'm really happy to receive emails. If you ask me for resources, I'll work for 10 hours to make you the best packages of resources that I can find you. So please don't hesitate to contact me. You can also go in the bottom right corner, my new venture that I'm starting with Erica, the Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction. We're doing consulting, but our long-term goals are to hire and employ and promote people who currently use drugs or used to use drugs. And we want to ask for their input, not just their sob stories. We want to ask people to inform policy and to tell us how to do our jobs better. And eventually, we want to get out of the way as have people who use drugs take our place. We also really encourage people to reframe their stories, because so often we hear stories that are just sad and we hear people beat themselves up. And we want to invite people to think about, what did you do that was right? What did you do during your pregnancy to protect your pregnancy and to protect and promote your health? Because there are multiple sides to all of these stories. It's not just people's substance use. And so we have a lot of goals, but those are a couple of them. And so if you go to our website, we're just building it right now, but you can fill out the form there, and we'll be contacting you when we get more resources up and going. We intend to have lots of free resources for healthcare consumers and pregnant people themselves, and we're hoping to get paid somehow to do the other stuff for